The sun dipped low over the rugged Montana mountains, painting the sky with streaks of fiery orange and soft purple. Brian Carter walked slowly along the cracked pavement, each step accompanied by the familiar creak of his worn leather boots. At 39, Brian was no stranger to heavy burdens. A former Army veteran, he had dedicated nearly 20 years of his life to serving his country. But since leaving the military 2 years ago, his days had been marked by an aching emptiness, a void that no job, hobby, or therapy session had been able to fill. His mind often drifted to his time in the service, not just the battles fought, but the bond he had shared with his loyal partner, Ranger, a German shepherd who had stood by his side through some of the most harrowing moments of his life. Now, as the golden light of dusk gave way to shadows, Brian found himself outside the town's modest animal shelter, summoned here by the insistence of his older sister, Ethan. "You need this, Brian," Ethan had said a few days earlier, her tone equal parts gentle and firm. "A dog could help. You can't keep shutting yourself off from the world." Brian had hesitated, brushing off her suggestion with a non-committal grunt. The idea of forming any sort of attachment, especially one that might stir up memories of what he had lost, felt like a risk he wasn't sure he could take. Yet, as the days stretched on, her words lingered in his mind. And now, here he was, standing before the shelter's entrance, the faint sound of barking punctuating the stillness. His hand rested on the doorframe for a moment as doubt crept in. What if this was a mistake? What if nothing could fix the hollow ache that had settled deep in his chest? But a small, stubborn part of him urged him forward. A whisper of hope he thought he'd lost long ago. The shelter was unassuming, its rusty fences and makeshift kennels a far cry from the pristine facilities Brian had imagined. The scent of disinfectant hung in the air, mingling with the occasional whine or bark from the rows of cages inside. Brian stepped through the doorway, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as though bracing himself for disappointment. A young shelter worker greeted him with a kind smile, her voice soft as she explained the adoption process. Brian nodded politely, his gaze already drifting toward the dogs. Some barked enthusiastically, their tails wagging in eager anticipation. Others sat quietly, their eyes somber and resigned. Brian moved down the aisle, his heart sinking a little further with each passing cage. None of these dogs sparked the connection he was searching for, the unspoken bond he had once shared with Ranger. Just as he was about to leave, the worker hesitated. "Wait," she said, her voice thoughtful. "We have a German shepherd in the back. He's special. You might want to meet him." Brian froze. A German shepherd. His heart quickened despite himself. Without a word, he nodded and followed her toward the far corner of the shelter, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years stirring within him. Hope. The air in the back of the shelter felt heavier, quieter, as Brian followed the shelter worker down the dimly lit corridor. His pulse quickened with each step, the thought of seeing another German shepherd flooding him with a mixture of hope and dread. The worker glanced back at him, her expression hesitant, as though she were bracing him for what was to come. "He's been through a lot," she said softly, her tone a warning as much as an explanation. "We found him at a smaller shelter in a neighboring state. He's anxious, doesn't trust people easily. But I think he might just need the right person." Brian didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and he nodded for her to continue. At the farthest end of the shelter, tucked away from the more excitable dogs, was a solitary cage. The German shepherd lay curled in the corner, his body stiff, his fur a familiar blend of black and tan. Brian's breath caught in his throat. Even from this distance, he could see the scars, one running down the length of the dog's back leg, another cutting across one of his ears. But it wasn't the physical injuries that hit Brian the hardest. It was the emptiness in the dog's eyes, a hollow, distant look that mirrored the weight Brian carried in his own. Brian stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor. "Ranger," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if saying the name aloud might shatter whatever fragile hope had begun to form. The dog lifted his head slowly at the sound, his ears twitching slightly. Their eyes met for the first time, and for a fleeting moment, Brian thought he saw a flicker of recognition. But it disappeared as quickly as it had come. Ranger's gaze returned to the floor, his body motionless, his tail unmoving. The dog that had once bounded into Brian's arms, full of loyalty and energy, now lay before him like a shadow of his former self. Brian swallowed hard, the lump in his throat almost unbearable. "He doesn't remember me," he murmured, his voice cracking under the weight of the realization. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, frustration and grief battling within him. He wanted to reach through the bars, to grab hold of something, anything that might bridge the chasm between them. But he knew better. Ranger wasn't the same dog he had known in the field, just as Brian wasn't the same man who had fought beside him. The shelter worker spoke gently, breaking the silence. "Would you like to spend some time with him? We could take him to the play yard." Brian hesitated, his chest tightening with doubt. But then he nodded, his voice steady with a determination he hadn't felt in years. "Yes," he said firmly. "Let's do that." As the cage door creaked open, Ranger didn't flinch, didn't react. Brian knelt down, extending a hand, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Hey, buddy, it's me. It's Brian." The German shepherd tilted his head slightly, as if trying to place the voice, but remained still, muscles tense. The distance between them felt insurmountable, yet Brian knew he couldn't give up. He wouldn't. Not on Ranger. Not on the bond they had shared. Whatever it took, Brian was determined to bring him back. The play yard was quiet, a patch of worn grass surrounded by a chain-link fence, illuminated by the soft glow of the fading sun. Brian stood in the center, his hands resting at his sides, watching as Ranger slowly stepped into the open space. The German shepherd's movements were cautious, every step deliberate, as though the world around him were a minefield waiting to explode. Brian's heart ached at the sight. This wasn't the fearless, energetic partner he remembered from the battlefield. But still, he couldn't look away. Beneath the layers of fear and hesitation, he could see glimpses of the dog he had once trusted with his life. Brian knelt down, pulling the old military vest from his bag, a vest that had accompanied them through countless missions. Its fabric was frayed, worn from years of service, and still carried the faint scent of sand and sweat. Holding it out, Brian let the vest rest on the ground a few feet away from Ranger. "Do you remember this, boy?" he asked softly, his voice carrying both a plea and a quiet hope. Ranger's ears twitched, his nose sniffing the air. For a moment, his eyes lingered on the vest, and Brian thought he saw a flicker of recognition. But it was fleeting. The dog lowered his head again, retreating a few steps, as though even the memory was too much to bear. Brian let out a slow breath, grounding himself in patience. Healing wasn't going to happen overnight, and he knew that. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice gentle as if speaking to a frightened child. "We'll go at your pace. I'm not going anywhere." He stayed kneeling, letting the silence stretch between them. The cool breeze rustled through the fence, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers and distant rain. Slowly, Ranger began to relax, his rigid posture softening just enough for Brian to notice. Reaching into his bag again, Brian pulled out another item, a worn rubber ball. It was scratched and faded, a relic of their time together. He rolled it gently across the ground, letting it stop a few feet in front of Ranger. "You used to love this, remember?" Brian said, his tone laced with both nostalgia and longing. Ranger didn't move at first, simply watching the ball as though it were a foreign object. Then cautiously, he took a tentative step forward, His nose twitched as he sniffed the ball, and for the first time, Brian saw a spark of curiosity. A tiny crack in the wall of fear that had surrounded Ranger since they reunited. Brian felt a lump rise in his throat, but he kept his emotions steady. "That's it, boy," he whispered. "Take your time. We've got all the time in the world." He stayed still, not wanting to overwhelm the dog. Ranger sniffed the ball again, his tail giving the faintest wag, barely noticeable, but to Brian, it was monumental. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, Ranger was beginning to trust him again. That night, as they returned home, Ranger followed Brian into the house, his steps slow but purposeful. Brian noticed how Ranger lingered near the doorway before cautiously settling down on the rug in the living room. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Brian sat nearby watching the dog as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. "We'll get there, partner," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." For the first time in years, Brian felt the warmth of hope. Ranger might be broken just as Brian was, but together they could start to heal, one small step at a time. The morning sun spilled through the windows, casting golden rays across the living room floor. Brian stretched, letting out a yawn only to spot Ranger sitting in his usual spot by the door, watching him with what could only be described as mild suspicion. Brian chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, buddy, you could at least pretend to like me," he teased, his voice light. Ranger didn't budge, his ears twitching ever so slightly. Brian grinned. "Silent treatment, huh? All right, game on." Determined to make progress, Brian decided to try something different. He grabbed Ranger's old favorite, a tennis ball that had seen better days. Its once bright yellow surface was now scuffed and dull, with a faint tear along one side. "All right, Ranger," Brian announced, holding up the ball like it was a grand prize. "This is your time to shine. Let's see if you still remember how to fetch." Stepping into the backyard, Brian felt a renewed sense of optimism. He stood in the middle of the open space, ball in hand, and gave Ranger his most confident look. "Okay, big guy, here we go." With an exaggerated wind-up, he threw the ball across the yard. It bounced and rolled, coming to a stop near the fence. Brian turned to Ranger with an expectant grin. "Fetch!" Ranger stared at the ball, then he stared at Brian, then back at the ball. His expression was the canine equivalent of an eye roll. Brian sighed, planting his hands on his hips. "Really? Nothing? You're killing me here, Ranger." Not one to give up, Brian decided to take it up a notch. He crouched down, mimicking a coach hyping up his star player. "Come on, boy, you've got this. Imagine we're back in the field. You're the hero, the superstar, the dog who can do anything." Ranger's ears perked up slightly, and Brian's heart leapt. "Yes, that's it. Now go get it." Ranger took one deliberate step forward. Brian held his breath. Another step, and then Ranger flopped onto the ground, stretched out, and let out the most dramatic sigh Brian had ever heard. Brian burst out laughing, clutching his knees as tears of amusement filled his eyes. "You've got to be kidding me, Ranger. That's your big move, laying down on the job?" Still chuckling, Brian walked over, picked up the ball, and tossed it again, this time a little closer. Ranger lifted his head, clearly unimpressed. But then, to Brian's astonishment, the dog stood up. Slowly but surely, Ranger walked over to the ball, sniffed it, and after a long moment, picked it up in his mouth. Brian watched, holding his breath as Ranger turned and walked, not toward him, but back to the shade of a tree, where the dog promptly dropped the ball and lay down. "You're impossible!" Brian called out, laughing despite himself. But then something magical happened. Ranger looked at Brian, wagged his tail, a tiny, hesitant wag, but a wag nonetheless. Brian froze, his grin widening. "That's it. I knew you had it in you." For the rest of the morning, Brian and Ranger repeated their little game, each round bringing a little more enthusiasm, a little more trust. By the end, Ranger was not only fetching the ball, but bringing it back, though sometimes he'd make Brian chase him for it first, a playful glint in his eye. Brian couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed so much. Ranger might have been stubborn, but he was coming back to life, one wag at a time. And for Brian, that was the sweetest victory of all. The gentle hum of the afternoon filled the house as Brian sat on the couch, his legs stretched out and a book resting in his lap. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Ranger lying on the rug nearby, his head resting on his paws. It wasn't just the physical closeness that struck Brian, it was the way Ranger's posture had softened. The tension in his shoulders, the ever-alert stiffness in his frame, seemed to have eased. Brian smiled faintly, pretending to focus on his book, though his mind was elsewhere. Slowly but surely, the walls Ranger had built around himself were coming down. The shift hadn't happened overnight, but in small, meaningful moments. It began with Ranger following Brian around the house, his quiet footsteps echoing through the halls as if the dog didn't want to be left behind. At first, Ranger kept his distance, always staying just far enough to maintain a sense of control. But now he seemed comfortable being in Brian's orbit, finding quiet reassurance in his presence. Brian couldn't help but feel a swell of pride every time Ranger chose to stay close. One afternoon, Brian decided to test this growing bond. While preparing lunch in the kitchen, he deliberately left the refrigerator door open longer than necessary, a slab of ham strategically placed on the counter. "Let's see if you're bold enough to make a move," he murmured with a grin, glancing over his shoulder. Ranger, lounging in his usual spot near the doorway, lifted his head and sniffed the air, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing the pros and cons of sneaking closer. Brian pretended not to notice, humming softly as he sliced bread. To his delight, Ranger stood, his paws padding softly against the floor. The dog paused a few feet away, clearly torn between his wariness and the tantalizing scent of lunch. Brian chuckled, turning to face him. All right, I'll make it easier for you." He held out a small piece of ham, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Come on, buddy. Trust me." Ranger hesitated, his gaze darting between Brian's hand and his face. For a moment, Brian thought the dog might retreat, but then Ranger took a step forward, then another. Finally, he stretched out his neck and gently took the ham from Brian's fingers. Brian didn't move, letting Ranger retreat at his own pace, but his chest swelled with emotion. It was such a small gesture, yet it meant everything. That night, as Brian settled onto the couch to watch a movie, Ranger did something he hadn't done since coming home. Instead of lying by the door or keeping his distance, Ranger climbed onto the rug near Brian's feet and rested his head against Brian's leg. Brian froze, not wanting to disturb the moment, but his heart raced with gratitude. Slowly, he reached down and ran his fingers through Ranger's fur. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing against Brian's. "You're starting to trust me again, aren't you?" Brian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The bond they had once shared was rebuilding itself, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, intimate moments of trust and connection. Brian knew they weren't fully there yet, but as he sat with Ranger at his side, he felt a profound certainty. They were on the right path, together. The park was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and the faint laughter of children in the distance. The sun hung high, its golden rays casting a warm glow across the sprawling green space. Brian tightened his grip on the leash, glancing down at Ranger, who walked beside him with a steadiness Brian hadn't seen in months. Ranger's posture was different today, his ears upright, his eyes scanning the park with a cautious curiosity rather than the anxiety that once dominated his every movement. Brian felt a flutter of hope in his chest. Today felt different, and he was determined to make the most of it. Stopping at an open field, Brian took a deep breath and unclipped Ranger's leash. "All right, boy," he said, his voice calm but tinged with anticipation. "This is it. Let's see what you've got." He reached into his bag and pulled out the familiar rubber ball, now scuffed from countless attempts to rekindle their bond. Ranger's eyes followed the motion, and for the first time there was something in his gaze: interest, focus, and maybe even excitement. Brian knelt, holding the ball out in front of him. "Ready?" he asked, his grin widening as Ranger's ears perked up. Without waiting for a response, Brian threw the ball across the field, watching as it bounced and rolled to a stop several yards away. For a moment, Ranger stood still, his body frozen as if processing the command. Brian held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Ranger darted forward, his legs propelling him across the grass with the speed and grace Brian remembered so well. "Go, Ranger! That's it!" Brian cheered, unable to contain his excitement. The sight of Ranger running again, his tail wagging and his body alive with purpose, sent a wave of joy through Brian that he hadn't felt in years. Ranger reached the ball, sniffed it, and hesitated briefly before picking it up in his mouth. He turned, his eyes locking onto Brian's, and began trotting back, the ball secure between his jaws. Brian's grin widened, tears stinging the corners of his eyes as he knelt to meet Ranger halfway. "You did it, buddy," Brian whispered, his voice thick with emotion as Ranger dropped the ball at his feet. "You really did it." Without hesitation, Brian picked up the ball and threw it again, and once more, Ranger bolted after it, his movements filled with an energy and joy that Brian hadn't seen in so long. The once distant dog, burdened by fear and trauma, was now sprinting across the field like he had found himself again. The two spent hours in the park, playing fetch and reliving the rhythm of their partnership. Brian's laughter rang out, unrestrained and genuine, as Ranger began to test his limits, sometimes running circles around Brian with the ball, daring him to chase. "Oh, so now you're showing off, huh?" Brian teased, his voice filled with warmth. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, both Brian and Ranger were exhausted, but glowing with a shared sense of triumph. As they walked back to the truck, Ranger stayed close by Brian's side, his tail wagging steadily. Brian reached down to pat Ranger's head, his voice soft but filled with pride. "We're back, partner. We're really back." The drive home was different that evening, lighter, filled with a sense of accomplishment. Ranger lay in the back seat, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but peaceful. Brian glanced at him through the rear-view mirror, a contented smile spreading across his face. The breakthrough they had worked so hard for had finally arrived, and Brian knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. Together, they had overcome the impossible, and the future, for the first time in a long time, felt bright. The moon hung high in the Montana sky, its silvery glow spilling over the quiet landscape of Brian's small ranch. Inside, the house was peaceful, the soft hum of the heater blending with the occasional crackle of the fireplace. Brian sat on the worn couch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, his gaze fixed on the old photo resting on the side table. The image captured a moment from years ago. Brian and Ranger side by side, dirt-streaked and exhausted, but beaming with pride after completing a grueling mission. It was a testament to their bond, a bond that had been tested by time, distance, and trauma but never truly broken. Tonight, Brian could finally feel that bond rekindling, stronger than ever. At his feet, Ranger lay stretched out on the rug, his head resting on Brian's leg. The dog's eyes were closed, his breathing deep and steady, a stark contrast to the restless, wary creature he had been weeks ago. Brian gently ran his fingers through Ranger's fur, his touch light, almost reverent. "You've come a long way, buddy," he murmured, his voice soft and thick with emotion. "We both have." The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Brian thought back to the early days when Ranger wouldn't even meet his gaze, when the dog's body was a fortress of fear and distrust. Brian himself had been no different, his heart locked away behind walls built by years of pain and loss. But through patience, love, and an unyielding determination to heal, they had found their way back to each other. Each small victory, a wag of the tail, a hesitant approach, a returned ball, had been a stitch in the wounds they both carried, slowly mending the invisible scars that had once seemed unhealable. Brian set his coffee aside and leaned down, resting his hand gently on Ranger's side. The warmth of the dog's body, the steady rise and fall of his chest, brought Brian a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in years. "You saved me, you know," he said quietly. His words meant as much for himself as for Ranger. "Back then, in the field, you kept me grounded. You gave me a reason to push through the worst of it. And now, you're doing it again." Ranger stirred slightly, his ears twitching as if he understood. He let out a soft, contented sigh, shifting closer to Brian's leg. Brian smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek as he gazed at his loyal companion. "We're not just surviving anymore, are we?" he whispered. "We're living, and it's because of you." As the fire crackled softly in the background, Brian felt something inside him shift, a weight lifting, a sense of peace settling in its place. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long was no longer there. In its place was gratitude, love, and a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, Brian allowed himself to hope, not just for the future, but for the present moment. Ranger, now dozing peacefully by his side, was more than just a dog. He was a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. Together, they had faced their pain, and together, they had come out stronger. Brian gently stroked Ranger's fur one last time before leaning back, his heart full. "We're whole again, partner. We've finally made it." As Brian sat on the porch, the morning sun rising over the Montana horizon, he reflected on the journey he and Ranger had traveled together. The quiet companionship of the German shepherd lying by his side spoke volumes about resilience, love, and the power of healing. Their bond had been tested by time, trauma, and distance, yet it had endured. Through patience and determination, they had found their way back to one another, proving that even the deepest wounds could mend with care and understanding. The story of Brian and Ranger was more than just a tale of a man and his dog. It was a testament to the strength of connection. It showed that healing often comes not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in the small, steady steps we take toward rebuilding trust. Brian learned that no matter how broken we feel, we are never beyond redemption, and Ranger reminded him that even in the face of pain, loyalty, and love can prevail. Their journey offered a simple but profound truth. Healing is a two-way street. By saving Ranger, Brian had also saved himself. Together, they had rebuilt not just a relationship but a purpose, proving that hope, once lost, can always be found again.